This week in Post, a Q&A session with a couple of this versus that questions. Hi everyone, I'm Scott Davenport. Welcome to In Post. Thanks for joining me, and thanks very much for sending in your questions. Your questions make this episode possible. If you've got questions about photography, send them my way. Love getting them. Makes me think about my photography. I'm hoping that my answers help you with your photography, and we all get better together. So let's just get right into a couple of questions I had about some this versus that scenarios. So Marvin from Florida asked, is JPEG format or TIFF format better as an interim file transfer between different photo processing programs? So for some context here, Marvin's using DxO to do his raw processing, and currently is exporting a JPEG to On1, doing some stylization, and then issuing out a final JPEG to have printed and do sales work with. And he's happy with the quality, and so that ultimately says, great, you're happy with the quality, you should continue doing what you're doing. Taking that step back and looking at, all right, interim file formats and so forth. Okay, well, JPEG is, strictly speaking, a lossy format. And so depending on how you're outputting the JPEG, you could be losing information. Since you like the quality you're getting, you're probably using a very high quality exported JPEG. So, again, not an issue for what you're seeing. Uncompressed TIFF is lossless, and so you don't lose any data at all. And so, strictly speaking, theoretical, that would be the quote-unquote better file format, just because you're not losing the information. What I would suggest is trying an experiment with some photo you've already put through this process, the JPEG route. Try using that TIFF in between and see if you notice a difference. If you do, maybe you want to make a change. If you don't, stick with what you're doing. One other thing to consider is with the TIFF is it's going to be a lot larger of a file. And so depending on how many photos you're working on and how many things you're pushing through your workflow, there could be some storage implications for that. That ripples to backup implications and how much extra you're going to have to spend on hard drives. So keep all those things in mind. And one other thought too is either of those formats, you're not able to take advantage of the Smart Photos feature in On1, where you can save and re-edit changes you've made in effects or so forth. That's only available with PSD files. So maybe a third thing to try is using a PSD in between there. I don't know DxO software, so I don't know if DxO supports PSD or not, but one other thing to take a look at. So Raj in the UK asked, do I use Photoshop or is On1 a good enough replacement for Photoshop? So Raj, this all depends on the definition of good enough. So I think it's probably best to a little mini history of my use of On1 versus Photoshop. When I reached a point in my photography where I wanted layering and I wanted some more stylization options than I had with Aperture at the time, this was before Creative Cloud existed, and Photoshop was a very expensive package. On1 was not, and I could do the things that I wanted to do with On1. I actually got the trial version, played around with it, ended up really liking it. And over time, Lightroom has caught up to a lot of the things that Photoshop can do. I can do just about everything that I need to do in On1. So for me, I don't need Photoshop. I do use it occasionally though. There are a few things that Photoshop does very, very well that aren't available in Lightroom or On1. One of the things that comes to mind is the transform warp tools in Photoshop. So some very wide angle shots of cityscapes where I want to remove some of that bending of buildings, not all of it, but some of it. Photoshop's great for that. Focus stacking is another thing I'll use Photoshop for. So I guess I use Photoshop as a very targeted program for specific tasks, but I'm not using it on a daily basis. I'd be pressed to say I'm even using it on a weekly basis. If it were not part of the Creative Cloud, I probably still would not have purchased Photoshop. I would not be able to justify the cost to myself. But part of Creative Cloud, I'll definitely take it and I'll use it for very targeted purposes. But with On1, Is it good enough to replace Photoshop? It really all depends on what you want to do with your photos. And so take a good look at, what are the different features that you need to process the images in the way that you want. And if there's certain things that Photoshop does that On1 doesn't, well, you probably want to have Photoshop in your mix of tools. The tip of the week, there is no such thing as authoritatively better. There's always trade-offs with anything in photography. File formats, you're probably trading off quality for storage space. Different tools, you're trading off functionality for potentially complexity. Following on from the On1 versus Photoshop discussion, I find Photoshop very confusing to use. I'm not familiar with it, which certainly plays a role, but it just seems that different functions are scattered all over the place, and I'm sure that's the nature of what happens when you have a piece of software that's 25 years old and does so many things. Stuff gets scattered around. So there's no such thing as this is always better. It really is what's better for your situation, whether it be how you work with your photos to how your brain thinks, because some tools are more intuitive to us than others, just because we're all different people. That does it for this week in Post. Hope you've enjoyed it. If you've got questions, please send them in. Love to hear from you. Tell a friend about the show. I'm hoping to get the subscriber count up a little bit. It generates more questions. It generates more excitement for me too, and makes me come back to the desk week after week to do these things. So until next time, my name is Scott Davenport, and happy shooting.